Staffan Lindberg's main current occupation is as director of the VDEM Institute at University of Gothenburg, and one of the 4 principal investigators of VDEM. And VDEM is an acronym for Varieties of Democracy. And Professor Lindberg's main research interests include comparative politics, democracy and democratization, especially in Africa, political institutions, public opinion, representation, legislators, members of parliament, corruption, and clientelism. So here you have the bright and dark sides together. And Staffan is a Wallenberg Academy scholar, and among many other tasks, I can mention that he is a member of the Young Academy of Sweden, the holder of an ERC Consolidator grant, and a member of the board of University of Gothenburg. So, very welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, Madam Vice Chancellor at Uppsala University, to talk to you about varieties of democracy and in this over this theme. And this is what I'll try to do in. Okay, we are almost 15 minutes late, right? So 30 minutes. First of all, we have been studying democratization for 60 years or so. And we've been trying to study its relationship to a lot of important things that are important for real people in the world. Of course, we think democracy has an intrinsic value in itself, but we're also interested in its relationship, whether there are causes to democracy and democratization, and there are effects of democracy. And we have a literature that's full of inconclusive and often contradicting findings. On the other side, we also sort of, not we maybe here, but some people in the room are involved in this. We also spend a lot of money in the world on support for democracy, human rights, good governance, and things like that. But we don't know if it works. And part of the problem is, or has been, that there's no sort of agreement about the definition of democracy or how to measure it. Right? There are a number of extant data set that were there before VDEM started, and you probably know a lot of them. They're sort of dichotomous measures that are good for certain things, but not very nuanced, right? You're either a democracy or a dictatorship. You have measures that are portraying to be a little bit more nuanced. Freedom House, not really a democracy measure, but it's being used like that. And the Polity 4, which is perhaps the most widely used measure among scholars, with the Polity 2 variable that ranges from -10 to +10, and Polity says in the methodology document nobody should use, and everybody goes ahead and use it. Right? So those are sort of the long time series, and there are a number of problems with them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but sort of justification for us to start is one of the sort of core things is that they're very, very narrow in their conception of democracy. So polity is being used mostly by scholars, right? It's a, somewhat competitive elections for the executive and a little bit of executive constraints on the executive, 40% suffrage, so women, you don't count, like it can be a democracy without you. And that's sort of it. So we set out to do this. Instead of measuring this very narrow conceptual space of what democracy is, take the core of democracy at the national level, representative democracy or electoral democracy, in its full sense as formulated by the theorist Robert Dahl, 1971, in Polyarchy, as the sort of understanding of full electoral democracy, and capture that entire space, but also the other traditions of democracy, both normative traditions, but also empirical. So liberal democracy saying electoral democracy is good, but it's not enough because it can lead to the tyranny of the majority. So we need civil liberties, we need separate elections for executive and a legislature that can keep checks on the executive, and a strong judiciary that can keep checks on both of those. And so think the United States, right? I don't have time to go through all of them. In Northern Europe, we're also influenced a lot by the egalitarian tradition that says, okay, electoral democracy is good, but it's not enough because even voting, which is the most egalitarian right, is structured by access to education, healthcare, and basic income protection. And I used to tease the Americans with healthcare, and maybe soon I can do it again when they repeal the Obamacare, if they do. If you don't have access to healthcare, you have a high probability of dying younger. And when you die, you can't vote, right? Except in some places in Africa that I study. There are a lot of people on the voter rolls, and they vote. So what we set out to do is sort of, this is what we do, right? So we have these big concepts of democracy, break them down into component parts, and what we actually measure are 350 very specific indicators of various things, right? That's what we actually measure and then aggregate up here. We do this with the help of almost 3,000 scholars and experts from across the world. So for each indicator, for each year, for each country, we should have 5 independent experts with a track record of studying media in Malaysia or the legislature in Zambia or whatever it is. And 3 out of the 5 should be from the country they code, or long-term residents there. So it's not white men in their 40s like myself, believe it or not, I'm still in my 40s, who decide how democratic that country is, right? And we sort of build it up. It's a lot of indicators. This polyarchy, the electoral democracy index, right, with this is the components that Dahl identified in 1971, and these are the indicators that go into it. And then when we measure something like liberal democracy, we must have electoral democracy, but we also need those liberal components I talked about, equality before the law, the judicial constraints, legislative constraints. We've done this now, so there's data from 1900, so 117 years, not only 100 like the Wallenberg Foundation, 117 years, to 2016 on all these indicators, the indices. 18 million data points on democracy. It's the largest database ever on democracy. So polity that used to be the biggest is about 200,000, just to sort of order of magnitude here. And next year, this will be increased to 181 countries. This is available online. Everything is online. You can sort of from the website. There are also, for those people who don't know statistics, don't want to download the data set and run it, we have online tools so you can graph your countries or compare regions and all kinds of things. And everything is documented. So one thing that we set out from the beginning was that we are going to have gold standards in social science or in science in general for everything, including documentation, transparency for everything we do. We also have a number of collaborations, including with International IDEA, Keb Wadse is here, and with sort of big international organizations like the World Bank and the UNDP on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also with sort of regional and local organizations, including things like Bibliotheca Alexandria in Egypt. And that is a challenging collaboration right now today, you can imagine, if you're familiar a little bit with what's going on in Egypt. It's a big international collaboration. I'm standing to talk to you here today. We have several people in the audience who have been part of building this project. Nonetheless, what has happened, because much of the funding has come from, almost all country funding has come from Europe, and much of the funding has come from Sweden, and through University of Gothenburg, we have now the hub, the VDEM Institute, and here's the team that worked there, a terrific team of young, brilliant people that are, just to tag on to what Göran said, everyone here except 3 are international recruitments. And mostly from American universities, but also some German and recruits and so on. Funding, yeah, the Wallenberg Foundations have been involved, Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden are big donors, European Commission as well, and University of Gothenburg, I should mention, has put in a lot of co-funding in this. Okay, so does it make any difference? Right? All this money. So here is a graph that compares from 1940, you could go back to 1900, but I did here 1940, sort of VDEM's electoral democracy measure, and then you have the polity measure and Freedom House. And this is standardized on a scale from 0 to 1, right? And our is more conceptually demanding than the other two, hence the average score is lower. That's the way it should be, right? Because we measure what we actually want to measure. And then we use all these people around the world that have in-depth knowledge in each country to measure all these individual indicators. And then sort of a big difference here is that polity only measures independent states. We include the colonies of the independent states, right? So Britain was relatively democratic, but the colonies in Africa and elsewhere were not. So this is more a measure of democracy in the world. So if you throw these things into regression analysis with all the outcomes that I talked about in the beginning, of course there will be differences. And also that we can show on these other, because nobody has ever before sort of measured participatory democracy or deliberative democracy, egalitarian democracy components across time for almost all countries in the world. And you can see that the lines, sort of just these averages now from 1900, are very different in the trajectories, including participatory component that sort of has, for most countries in the world, much lower values than anything else. This is another difference you get if you start to look at this difference at the individual country level, right? So you look at the United States, so polity scores and then Freedom House, the yellow one here, has been perfect. Like United States has been perfect since 1815, right? No matter women, minorities of various kinds, civil liberties movements, anything, right? Whereas in VDEM, it doesn't really become a good democracy after the civil liberties movement in the 60s. And the same with Sweden, sort of we were not that good here, but then 1917, male suffrage, and then we're perfect. Whereas here is sort of the electoral democracy score. There are other country examples that are sort of strange. So Zimbabwe, so white rule Rhodesia, according to polity, was pretty good, right? Doesn't sort of meet face validity to me. Our democracy measures are better. Similar for India, being almost perfect immediately. There are also issues with Freedom House that sort of makes for these differences you see in the overall global averages. Kenya is an interesting example. With democracy sort of according to their measures being actually better here during one-party rule than after the first and second elections that were multi-party, and the only reason that Moi won was actually because the opposition couldn't unite. We could go down the line, but there are sort of other things. Let me show you another aspect of what. So here you see the difference in Ghana between the polyarchy score, the electoral democracy score, and participatory democracy and the trajectories over time. And while sort of polity and VDEM track for Ghana relatively well, both of them, participatory democracy has a different trajectory, right? So if you're interested in participatory democracy, suddenly you have a tool for doing research on that. So that's bright, right? It's good. Now you have all these things. And then some sort of dark sides. Well, there's a little drop here. It's within our confidence interval, so that's another difference. We have confidence intervals around all our measures. You could sort of say, okay, I'm interested in that drop. What's this coming from? And then, because we have this hierarchical tree structure, right, you can drill down and see what's driving that change. You can actually do that online as well. You can double-click on lines, then they open up into all the component parts. That's a nice feature. But, so we do that. Now the polyarchy score became this blue, thicker line over time, and then some of the components it became too messy with too many lines, so I picked out 3 of them. And then, of course, I picked one that's driving this. That's the freedom of the elections, our clean elections index. Whereas alternative source of information, freedom of association, is still the same, right? So we know now that that's driving it. Okay, then we want to know, this was made up of a bunch of indicators, remember that? So we want to drill down and see what aspects of the free elections have become worse in Ghana that's driving this dip in the index. So we drill down into that yellow line, and now they're on different scales because the indicators are typically from 0 to 4, but the indices are 0 to 1. So but the dip is still there, right? And then you can see that what's driving it here, it's the EMB autonomy and the voter registry. that are becoming worse. And for anybody who knows what happened in Ghana around the 2012 elections was that the incumbent government was able to put in people on the electoral management board because they were positioning open up, and they didn't clean the votes registry. So there were a lot of dead people and double names on the registry that could be used for double voting. So those are the two things. So you can drill down and see exactly what's driving things at the aggregate level. Okay. I'm not doing too bad. So we presented in the spring this report. It's also available on the website for download. The annual report 2017, where we took stock a little bit about what's happening in the last part of especially the last 10 years. This is sort of the state of democracy in the world. No big surprises. Dark countries are very democratic, and light countries not so much, right? But there's been this discussion about backsliding, and this is the worry that was also expressed in some of these introductory notes here. And according to Freedom House, and that's what sort of much of this discussion in the academic community has been based on, is sort of, yeah, there's a slight backsliding. Polity doesn't have any backsliding. We have maybe, but it's way within the confidence intervals. Right? So aggregate level, global average, there's no big trend. So that's bright, right? Bright side. But here is maybe a little worrying trend. So here we calculate then the number of countries that make improvements, statistically significant improvements, and statistically significant backsliding, right? And here's the third wave of after 1989, the fall of Berlin Wall, lots of countries make improvements. But here we have sort of maybe a beginning trend, if it continues, of more countries that have significant backsliding. But we also look at what, among the countries that have these statistically significant changes in some of the indicators that we talk about, the electoral democracy index here. What are the things that have changed over the last 10 years, right? And then you can see that sort of, if you're up here, you're good, right? And if you're down here, you're bad. Oh, I didn't put in the, sorry, I forgot the years. So you have 2006 here, and you have 2016 here. So we can see these are L variables, L free and fair. Elections are free and fair, elections, no intimidation, election, irregularities, election. Those are the things that are getting better. Those are visible events. International community are there. The press is there. Every eyes are on you. So that's where the governments have been sort of making more of window dressing, making those things that are easily to observe better. At the same time, what's been going down significantly has to do with ME is media, CL is civil liberties. And so it's sort of behind the scenes, less visible repression of civil liberties and making media less critical of the government, making them exercise more self-censorship and things like that are much harder to track and sort of get much less visible. So that's a worrying trend to us. So that's on the dark side. Here, same thing. You have 2016 here. And here are the countries that have significantly backslid. That's what you say, backslid, right? Yeah. And here are the positive cases. So you see a number of cases that we have heard about in the media and that we don't want to see in this side, right? Hungary, Poland, Brazil. Bolivia, Serbia, but also less discussed in the European context, Serbia, Macedonia, and of course Ukraine. And the worst one being Turkey in terms of sort of radical change. And we sort of know that that country has become a dictatorship. This is not in the report. Oh yeah, this is still in the report. If you only look at the last 5 years, sort of, it's very much the same countries that show up as the top backsliders. But we sort of talk less about the improvements, those countries that improve. And then, of course, you can say, like I've gotten this comment before, it also matters which countries. It's more important if Turkey, Russia, Hungary, maybe big countries, and the US that we're talking about now, if they sort of go back, than if maybe a small country, Equatorial Guinea improves a little bit, or something like that, right? So this is there. And then in a forthcoming article now in October in Journal of Democracy, we also use the VDEM data to divide countries into regime types. And I want you to sort of note this category, the electoral autocracies. That's the form of dictatorship that have become so much more common in the world after the end of the Cold War. They hold elections, they're often multi-party, at least by the constitution, but there is enough repression and undermining of electoral procedures and undermining of media freedom that it can count as a democracy. But they try and look like a democracy, right? And when we look at those countries that are electoral autocracies and what they, sort of the most common ways they backslide, the indicators that most changes most often. Civil society repression, government control of civil society, and political killings. It's more obvious there. Whereas here is where we really worry also about electoral democracies. They're sort of minimally democratic, and we accept them as democracies, but we also worry about them falling back. And here you see much more of these sort of less visible indicators, the ones that you can do behind the scenes. Make sure the media doesn't report so critically about the government. So that's worrying trends. And you can also see here that democratic advances in these electoral autocracies are, again, these election variables, right? So it's the window dressing where it's out there in the international media. Okay. I have 10 minutes left, I think. Okay, so a couple of examples of some new findings that have been a little bit sort of unexpected or so on. This is something we've published in Government or Opposition, and it was on Africa, which was my old sort of research area. And it's basically sort of, yeah, democracy is about competition, right? And if you start buying votes, then you undermine that competition and the accountability mechanism in democracy. So it shouldn't be a good thing. But we also sort of drawing on the work on democracy and corruption that some people in this room have been involved in, sort of in Equatorial Guinea, in a really close dictatorship, you don't need to buy votes, right? The president just walks into the electoral management body and say, okay, I won with, should we say 93.8%? Is that okay? Yeah, good. Right, I mean, you don't even count the votes, right? But when you become a little sort of electoral autocracy, these that have become very common now, then at some point you may start worrying about your support, or you want to show that you have more support than you do, and you can't really sort of manipulate everything. So you have to start buying votes and make sure sort of vote for me, and right? So you should see an increase, and then only when democracy becomes, you know, you have full media freedom and judiciary and all that, then vote buying should go down. And so we look at that, and it's sort of lots of robustness checks, time series, cross-sectional, fixed effects, blah, 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 and other models as well, and here how they look like, and nobody cares about those, but they are there, so I have to show them. But here's the effect, right? And so that's vote buying, right? So you have this curved linear relationship between low level of democracy and higher level of democracy. So we thought that was fun, and we to say that vote buying is actually a good sign. When countries democratize, you should expect vote buying to go up for a while. It's not necessarily bad. Another thing that we did in a group was to look at the role of women's, because for the first time in VDEM, we have these cross-national and long-time series disaggregated data on women and men's access to civil liberties, right? And we wonder if it matters then if women also get sort of a decent or relatively comparable level of civil liberties before countries democratize? And yeah, that was the question. So we use these variables on civil liberties and look at their relationship to democracy. Now, I don't have the time to go into this, but on the team we have an evolutionary biologist, a mathematician, a statistician, a sociologist, and the VDEM team. So not only political scientists. So we worked and borrowed some methods from evolutionary biology to look at the overtime relational sequence relationship between civil liberties. And here's just an illustration of the results. In one way of illustrating the result. And the bubbles are the number of observations, and the lines here are the sort of thickness of the lines, how many countries move between those observations. And this is the electoral component index. And basically, no country in this 170 years, very few instances of countries that make a good sort of transition to a somewhat good level of democracy before they have had also civil liberties, high civil liberties for women. Maybe an intuition for why Tunisia, among the Arab Spring countries, has sort of made it, whereas the others haven't. Women got relatively high civil liberties in Tunisia already in the 1950s. Good. Okay, so you have, so you get to democracy somehow, according to these things, with vote buying and civil liberties for women. And then, does it matter how your civil society and your party system looked like before you transition to democracy, before your survival of democracy, that we also care about? So again, this is sort of survival analysis, lots of technicalities, but the core here is we look at the civil society index that we have and the party institutionalization index, and we look at the level of those before the transition to democracy, and then look at the probability of democratic breakdown, or the antithesis of survival. And here's the results for civil society. Party systems looks very much the same. Basically, if you before transition are in the highest, the fourth quartile, the highest quartile in terms of civil society strength, democracy sort of never dies, right? Whereas if you're in the lowest quartile, the first quartile, before transition, most democracies die within the first sort of 15 years. Right? Those are sort of the statistical predictions that come out of it. So this suggests that it's very important to have strong civil society and strong party systems institutionalization before democratization. I want to show another favorite of mine, and that is currently under review. So this is not published yet, but basically, does democracy then, if you have democracy, you get to democracy, it survives, and then does it have any good effects, right? And what aspects of democracy have any good effects? And the dependent variable here is infant mortality, right? And then looking at a very short time series, 1996 to 2012, which is where we've had sort of data on corruption and things like that before. In that short time series, democracy doesn't have any significant effect on reducing infant mortality. The big drivers, of course, are GDP and things like that, right? But with this long time series that we now have access to, then democracy actually has a statistically significant effect. But it's also, so when you improve electoral democracy, then later infant mortality goes down. But it's also a conditional relationship that's being shown here. So if you interact it with the legislature, how strong the legislature is in its capacity de facto to exercise oversight over the executive. right? How much can they hold the government accountable? Then, if the legislature is weak, even if your level of electoral democracy quality improves, nothing happens with infant mortality. But whereas if the legislature is strong, there's this very significant effect. And this is exactly what democratic theory have sort of wanted to find for a long time, but we haven't really had the full amount of data and detailed data to test it. Because if you live in a place where your kids die, that's a serious issue, right? And that's something you should hold your representatives accountable for, right? Build some clinics and get us some nurses and better delivery care and all that, and postnatal care, right? Yeah, 30 seconds. But it's often much harder to hold sort of a president or something like that accountable for that. Whereas through your legislatures, that's where you can often sort of have a closer relationship, make sure that they know that you want them to improve the health care. But they must also be empowered then to hold the executive, who is actually responsible for dispersing money and implementing policy and so on, to make sure that they actually do it, right? So it's a link that must be fulfilled. So I think that's, yeah. On that note, let me say thank you for the time, and thank you for listening so long to me.
Now, we are, as Staffan said, 15 minutes late, but we will, this is exciting, and how many things you can do with this data set, it's wonderful. So we have also here two doctoral students from Uppsala University, and we have asked them to pose questions and comments. So we start with Emma Elversson, Uppsala University. Where are you? There.
Thank you so much for unpacking democracy for us and showing some of the really interesting stuff we can do with this data. You mentioned in your talk and in this annual report also, you bring up that there is some evidence that there might be a bit of a backslide happening, and I wanted to pick up on that. And I wonder if you look at this longer time series, is this backslide something that might even be expected? If you look at previous waves of democratization, for instance, is this something that has been happening before?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay, yes.
We had the first wave, and then backsliding, right, in the 1920s, 30s, the World War, second wave after the Second World War, independence of colonies, and Europe becoming democratic again, plus Japan and so on, right? And then sort of a little bit of backsliding then in the 60s and 70s, military juntas and blah, 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 one-party regimes. You know, a lot of the African colonies that became independent, it was one man, one vote, one time, right? This is yes.
Yeah, so, and following up on that then, if you can we use this? I mean, is the current trend similar to, can you see patterns that have come up before? Is it the same type of mechanisms taking place now? So one can, for instance, imagine that after a certain degree of democratization takes place, incumbent elites become so threatened that they begin to push back, for instance, or are current dynamics different from the past? And so building on that, what can we learn from the past in terms of trying to anticipate and counteract potential democratic backslides?
Well, I can't say this with sort of certainty and looked into all the details and all that, but just the second wave was a lot of military coups and sort of rapidly going from the first elections into one-party states. Whereas what's happening now, and we've seen in many countries, are the sort of worst dramatic in Turkey, of course, with Erdogan being elected into office with democratic procedures, and sort of gradually over, maybe we should say at least 7-8 years, turning it into a dictatorship. That's an electoral autocracy still, because constitutionally still has multi-party elections and all that. And similar in Hungary with sort of Orban wanting illiberal democracy and cracking down in various ways on the freedom of media and academia. The Central European University is under threat. And I would say similar, at least, tendencies in the United States. And you have Poland and before that Serbia, Macedonia, and so on. So that reminds more of the reversal after the first wave, right? Hitler was also elected, right? I mean, and we could discuss the quality, blah, 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 and all that, but he was, right? Yeah. But there's, in some ways, there may be more similarities there, but there, I would definitely not go as far as say at least we're seeing the same thing happening again. But obviously it's also the right-wing movements from populist right-wing movements that we're witnessing in the world today that sort of reminds us of that ugly period.
So obviously we will have issues in the panels later today to discuss this. Yes, please. So the next doctor student to pose questions and comments is Sebastian van Balen, also from Uppsala University. Please.
Thank you. And thank you, Staffan, for a really engaging presentation about the VDEM project. It really looks very exciting. So me and Emma were discussing, and obviously being from the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, we also have to ask about the relation between democracy and violence. Because to us it seems that democracy is generally something that's good for peace. But what we also see is that in a lot of post-war countries, elections are either followed by violence or can even restart the war. This happened in Kenya or in Cote d'Ivoire, which we are working on. So we were wondering, first of all, are we focusing too much on elections? And secondly, what can the VDEM project tell us about how the democratization can come about without pushing too much for elections in post-war countries?
Yeah, difficult question. We have people right now working on civil war and democracy, but also interstate war and democracy, and I think some of them are here. So maybe they should answer that question more. You know, in my own research before and using the VDEM data and looking at sort of this idea that we have to sequence things and elections need to come late, doesn't seem from my perspective to be universally true in any way, right? There are many instances, and it tends to be sort of more to the contrary, right? Depending, of course, it depends on many sort of individual conditions in each country and the case, but sort of looking at it generally, that elections can rather be a vehicle for achieving that post-conflict agreements, right? And learn how to sort of fight peacefully, if you like. But I think the jury is still out there. I think we need to do a lot more work on subsets of countries and periods as well to see under what conditions it's good to hold the elections early, under what conditions is it better to wait a little later. So, I'm sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.